Okay, let's get started. My name is Sid Moen. I serve as co-director of Interfaith Action of Southwest Michigan. It's my delight to welcome all of you to this launch of our 2022 discussion series entitled Theologies of Transformation, Actions of Justice. Our work hopefully will contribute to the historic and the growing contemporary body of literature around public theology. And these programs will also be maintained as podcasts in our resource library so that they contribute to the field in the future, as well as are accessible for small group discussions at a later point in time. Public theology is something that has influenced much of my spiritual formation, beginning, I think, with William Stringfellow, influencing my Christian formation in his important book entitled A Public and Private Faith. And then I would reference Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, whose important book to me, The Dignity of Difference. And then I'm reminded of Thich Nhat Hanh, who died just last week, a key advisor and influencer of Martin Luther King Jr., really somewhat responsible for King's anti-war activism and adoption of pacifism as part of his public theology framework. Nhat Hanh introduced the concept of engaged Buddhism, applying Buddhist principles to public political reform. And then finally, I would add one of our presenters, Dr. Mahan Mirza, whose keynote in the 2021 annual lecture on faith and civic life made a powerful presentation entitled A Life of Faith Beyond Individual Worship to Work for the Common Good. Krista Tippett, in a past segment on being, defined public theology in part by this. Number one, it has to emerge from the vast diversity of our modern lives, and in some cases to uproot our traditional grounds. And number two, it is to articulate spiritual points of view, to challenge and to deepen our thinking on questions in public and political life. So that's what we're up to this year. That's why we are delighted to have our panelists engage in a beginning discussion with us. Let me introduce them. I've already started an introduction to Dr. Mahan Mirza. He is the director of the Ansari Institute on the Engagement of Global Religions at Notre Dame University, former dean of faculty at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, which was the United States' first fully accredited Muslim liberal arts college. His MA is from Hartford Seminary, his PhD in religious studies from Yale. Second, we're delighted to have Rabbi Karen Campanez, who's the first female rabbi at Temple Beth El in South Bend, where she's been for about 7 years. Prior to her work in South Bend, she spent about 13 years in Flint, Michigan. She is ordained from the Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion, has her BA in philosophy from Monash University in Melbourne. As an immigrant, she presided at an interfaith service in South Bend about 5 years ago in support of Dreamers, translating her immigrant experience into justice work on behalf of new immigrants. Dr. Melinda Berry is the Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart. She is the chair of the History, Theology, and Ethics Department at the seminary. Her master's in philosophy is from Union Theological Seminary, where she also received her PhD. She's commenting tonight from both Anabaptist theological perspectives, but also from feminist and womanist perspectives. I think each of you who registered for this event received a copy of our draft 10 public theology principles. These were developed last year by a study group that looked at Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which is perhaps the most universal and most recent statement on public theology from a Catholic perspective. And I'd like to thank Dr. Clark Gilpin, Dean Emeritus of the University of Chicago Divinity School, and Bobby Gaunt, former senior warden at All Saints Episcopal Church, who led that study series last year. So let's jump into the discussion. And there are no formal presentations. We are hopeful for lively conversation. Panelists, feel free to interrupt each other, express your candid perspectives and your guidance as we look to refine our principles, particularly in accord with Krista Tippett's challenge that our public theology should be informed by the diversity of our society. So as each of you looked at our 10 draft principles, were there any that jumped out to you as discordant with a Muslim, a Jewish, an Anabaptist, a womanist perspective?
Well, I can answer that in one word, and the word is no.
Well,
but I also want to say before that, thank you, Sid, for inviting me, and the Ansari Institute and everybody else who was responsible. I'm sure there were others to this conversation, but that would be my succinct answer to the first question.
Thank you. Others of you, chime in.
Who can disagree with the politics of tenderness? You know, I was when the principles began with that particular point, I was reminded of one of the first hadiths, prophetic traditions, when people go to learn the tradition at the feet of traditional scholars. One of the first traditions they learn is, it says, and I'll say it in Arabic because you can hear the kind of word, there's an oral aspect to the tradition. Ar-Rahimuna yarhamuhumullah. Irhamu man fil ard yarhamkum man fis sama. Which is those people who are merciful. So our traditions have slightly different vocabularies. Instead of tenderness, perhaps the word mercy is more salient, but they obviously overlap and intersect. But what the tradition says is, and this is a tradition, by a tradition I mean the saying of the Prophet Muhammad in the Islamic tradition, that those people who are merciful, God has mercy on them. And then the second part is, Irhamu man fil ard, have mercy on everybody who's on earth, all who are on earth. Yarhamkum man fis sama, so the one who's in the heavens will have mercy on you. There's a lot of resonance across these points. And what just strikes me about that particular tradition is it puts together all these relationships, is that religiosity is never private, that it's relational. And so the people who are being addressed, they have a relationship to others on earth and also a relationship to God.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on the linguistic piece here, because Dr. Mirza has mentioned in Arabic and Hebrew, it's the same word, rachamim or rachaman, you hear the same. And in Hebrew, the word for, so rachamim, merciful, you know, translated many different ways. Somebody wrote an entire thesis, I think, on the meaning of the word rachamim. But within the word rachamim, you hear also the word rach, which is tender. And one of the names for God in Hebrew is Harachaman, the merciful. Sorry, Melinda, just wanted to put that in there as well.
No, thank you. Thank you. Well, and I agree, like that opening phrase about the radical revolution of tenderness. I mean, there's an in English, certainly there's a fascinating kind of juxtaposition of those terms that I find really endearing. But I will, and this is a piece of my personality. I sometimes need to be adversarial, even if there's agreement. I will push a little bit on, let's see, I think it's principle number 8 that speaks about migration. And I think what I would have to say here from a womanist perspective is the importance of noting the nuance, but and the difference between immigration and migration. And so I think it's to the credit of these principles that the terminology chosen here is migration rather than immigration. Partly because I was reading a children's book that was written and created out of the 1619 Project of the New York Times. And as it's telling the story of enslavement and the North Atlantic and the Atlantic slave trade, there's a refrain in there. As Black people, we are not immigrants, as a way of trying to heighten the tension around, from an intercultural standpoint, the tendency in the United States to say that the United States is a nation of immigrants, right? Trying to kind of minimize the complex stories of how people who are part of this country came to be part of this country. And so to opt for the language of migration rather than immigration is something that I want to affirm, while also noting that it's important to attend to those distinctions between immigrants and migrants, because, well, there would be some people who came to this country through their ancestral trajectories and would reject that label of immigrant, like being part of a nation of immigrants. So for what that's worth. But again, with my co-panelists here, there is a lot to affirm in these 10 principles.
Well, and a good point. And again, from work in the global arena, migration is more typically used than it is in a US lexicon. And the point you make is the African slave trade is a horrendous example of the most violent form of forced migration that we have experienced. Some folks have questioned me when I've used the term womanist theology. So let me allow you, since this is part of your scholarly work, to comment on the definition of womanist theology.
Well, Sid, would you be willing to maybe say a little bit more, like what kinds of challenges do people bring to you, or how are you pushed? Yeah.
Well, let me bring my experiences rather candidly and perhaps embarrassingly to the conversation. Historically have been more attenuated to feminist theology writings and concepts. Perhaps over the past 2 years, hearing more conversation, more literature around womanist theologies, which seem to be more gender inclusive. And I'm hearing more conversations around womanist theologies, particularly from Latin Americans. Now that's my limited contribution, and so please
Sure.
elucidate for me and others.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, so womanist theology has a couple of different kinds of pools or currents, I mean, depending on how you want to kind of work with these metaphors. And the term itself comes from the writings of Alice Walker, who herself is a Buddhist, right? And so represents a fascinating journey to an interfaith consciousness and way of viewing the world. And part of what she was trying to signal in the late 70s and early 80s was the need for a social analysis that recognized that liberation for women is not a one-size-fits-all t-shirt, right? That for some women, what would be liberating is to be able to leave the home and peel away the necessity of taking care of children and, you know, kind of the suburban mom and leave it to Beaver. But what that image of the 1950s housewife who's feeling discontented can gloss over is the pretty good chances that her life was being facilitated, her lifestyle was being facilitated by a woman of color who left her children at home to come take care of someone else's children, right? So that to leave the house is liberative for some, but to stay at home is liberative for others, right? So that Alice Walker is pointing to how context matters, would be one way to say it. So that the womanist thinking centers Black women's experience, and here we're speaking in a kind of far-reaching diaspora kind of way, that we aren't just talking about Black women in the United States. And as womanist theory has developed, you know, hey, you know, we're academics and we like to fight over all kinds of things. So some of these distinctions and divisions are friendlier than others. But as womanism, both theoretically and then more particularly in the religious disciplines has matured and taken shape, there are some different directions and trajectories. And certainly a piece of it is the movement toward, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of interfaith consciousness. But there are other forms or expressions of womanism that are much more focused on Black women's experience within the Christian tradition, and with a focus, a particular kind of focus on the coming together of race, class, and gender. And so Kimberly Crenshaw's discussions of intersectionality kind of ring very true there. But
which is also one of our principles.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Right. But I would also say then kind of in the academic context, and some of this is also getting into Martin Marty's categories of public theology, you know, where, well, and I guess David Tracy too, where you have, you know, this public is made up of society, the academy, and then local faith communities. So womanist conversation kind of crisscrosses all of these places. But like in an academic context, for example, this is probably a little more than a decade ago, I attended a session at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, sponsored by one of the womanist groups, that was emphasizing interfaith conversation, and partly because within the Christian expression of womanism, there is a a very strong movement to the story of, among Christians, we would say of Hagar, right? The mother of Ishmael. Well, you can't start talking about Hagar or Hajar without, or if you're going to do that with an integrity, then it immediately needs to become an interfaith conversation, right? And so that is so there have been womanist and feminist scholars who have worked at interfaith conversation around that particular story. So I mean, there's more that could be said. Probably that's even a whole entire panel. But how I think about what womanism is or kind of methodologically for my work, womanism is interested in helping people identify the communal core of their belonging, right? And so that all of our public and private engagements sort of start at that core and then ripple out from there. So oftentimes in my own teaching, that's what I use. That's part of how, because I work in a predominantly white institution with predominantly white students, or students coming from the global South, so that we're also trying to do a kind of intercultural, international translation of some of these principles. Why are you doing what you're doing, and who are you doing that for, or on whose behalf, or accountable to whom, right? Is one of the primary womanist questions that I think is really important for everybody to be able to wrestle with and respond to.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, my first introduction was by a Chilean former Catholic, now Muslim woman, speaking on an interfaith panel about the womanist commitments that were guiding her. Well, as you looked at these principles, what jumped out as a void? What was glaringly missing?
So I was sort of a little bit surprised, I suppose, and maybe I've just missed it. There's no talk of rights, anything being a right. And here I'm thinking about things like the right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to be housed, the right to have enough food, etc. And also, it's kind of, I suppose it's implicit in some of the points, but the idea that we humans are the only ones who can fix any of the problems of the world. So you've kind of enumerated all these areas that need attention, or that we could come together around, but and maybe that's just so obvious that it doesn't bear inclusion explicitly, but that kind of struck me.
Excellent point, and I hang my head a bit with that comment, because my prior role was heading up a human rights organization. So the Universal Declaration has been of great guidance and focus for me. So thank you for noticing that. Other items that are absent.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. Thank you for that, Rabbi Karen. I noticed that the word justice isn't here, although there are themes of justice. So I kind of withdrew my observation, but I just point out that although the idea is obviously expressed, point 7, racism and systemic inclusion, the preferential option for the poor, etc., are obviously to advance the idea of justice. But justice and mercy, I mean, that's one of the, those two go together. And perhaps there may be a way to balance tenderness with a kind of firmness. And these kind of polarities or dyads, in a way, that's probably not the best word, are also deeply theological when we think of the attributes of God in the Islamic tradition. And so There's a wonderful scholar, Sachiko Murata, comes from the Asian traditions, but she wrote a book on the Tao of Islam, where she looks at the attributes of God, drawing on the mystical traditions of Islam as having primarily feminine and masculine attributes and how those interact with each other. So maybe that's a meandering point that I'll make, but I'll direct us to number 3, where I saw a deep tension that maybe we can talk about, or you can comment on, either our other panelists or you, Father Sid, where it begins with this idea of common life. And is it point number 3?
Yes.
Hang on. Let me get to the right one. Yeah, that's it. So a common table where all are welcomed, right? So it begins with this idea, and it ends with we reject individualism. So there's a welcoming and everyone's together, but then we reject individualism, tribalism, nationalism, and God and me pietism. And so the thought that I had was, when we're considering these points in the context of a national dialogue, how do we have dialogue with people who are deeply, who we differ from in very deep ways, who are individualistic, or who have a certain kind of pietism, or who come with tribal ideas about religion and nationalism, who may be excluding the other for whatever reasons. So we have a common table, but from the outset, we've said this kind of person is either not welcome at the table or sits at another table. So that's an interesting tension that we can play with.
Yeah, good point. And we may have been endeavoring to connect somewhat dissimilar dots. One being the powerful imagery of a common table around which all are welcome. And then second, kind of a commitment to communitarianism, which perhaps is more fully formulated in our principle around the common good. But something for us to reflect on and look at as we revise. So thank you for that.
Just want to comment on this common table thing. So when my gut reaction to that was, oh, Christian, that's just to note. But also, and I don't know, because I don't know enough about many peoples around the world, but it would seem to me that the eating, and I thought about eating at a table. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but it seems to me that most of the world's population probably don't eat around a table.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered what you had in mind. Maybe I was wrong about all my assumptions about what you might have had in mind with this so-called common table.
Well, as I try to recollect the discussions, there was certainly the Christian table concept, but there was also commentary around the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, where the seat of worship moved from the temple to the family table, where the traditions of worship were continued even to the Sabbath meal that is family celebrated. So that also was woven into this kind of common table discussion. And then I've been doing some readings on the early proto-Christian 1st and 2nd century community, which really was a Jewish community, sometimes described as these supper clubs where people would meet to share a meal, to have social support, and kind of a spirit of solidarity, because they were subject to the oppression of the Roman Empire and were outcasts from the Roman Empire. So those were kind of some of the components that led to this common table concept. But I clearly hear the concerns about, I guess, those who benefit, who don't have tables of plenty.
Yeah. Also, I think, issues of like theological uniqueness and genuine diversity, and a kind of pluralism that also permits for uniqueness of traditions. How do those imperatives get balanced? So there's a common table, or whatever appropriate word is necessary to convey that idea. But then there are times when there are separate tables. Is that ever okay, or is that never okay? Or what conditions will make that beautiful, and what conditions would make that abhorrent? So I think that's something to play with a little bit more carefully. Also, so there this maybe categorical nature of some of the sentences. So we reject individualism, tribalism, nationalism, and God and me pietism. So maybe God and me pietism is okay, but it's not the only kind of or an absolute God and me pietism. Like above on point number 2, we recognize that storytelling is key to our faith, but maybe we recognize that storytelling is one key aspect of our faith, or one important aspect, because it's not necessarily the only one, and for different traditions, maybe more or less defining. So tempering perhaps the language in some ways here.
Thank you.
I would even delete the whole table reference. And I see people are putting in the chat that it's symbolic. Yeah, symbolic. But I mean, what Father Sid, I'm not sure how you like to be addressed. Sid, what Sid was saying about, the references to the temple and the references to the small sanctuary, the table. I mean, that only works if you actually either know the tradition or come from that tradition, or both. And I would say the majority of the world's population doesn't. So if you're trying to do something universalistic, the table thing just doesn't seem to work.
Okay.
From my perspective. Yeah.
So
well,
I want to just jump in here quickly, because there's a couple of things that have been said that I don't want us to lose track of. One, I think the term dyad is a really helpful word, because we seem to be allergic at this kind of cultural moment to talking about binaries, and assuming that all binaries are oppositional, which they are not. So a dyad being a way of talking about two things that are related to each other and help us define, like, in positive and negative terms, I think is very important and very useful. The other thing I want to maybe say here too around this discussion is, I think we're rightly pointing out a tension that is here in number 3, and so maybe the issue has more to do with the things that create obstacles for us, maybe either individually or in the particular tradition or stream within our religious categories that we're coming into interfaith conversations from. Like, so it seems like if we're interested in cultivating a common life, developing awareness around the things that are obstacles to entering as fully as we might into this common life, or this sort of shared reality. And so there might be things that sometimes I, as a Christian, need to be willing to for a particular interfaith encounter, set aside and approach with a spirit of curiosity. Not saying that I'm abandoning my beliefs, but setting them aside in order to explore something else and then re-engage and renegotiate this commitment over here that I may not have reflected on very deeply. But I am super intrigued by this discussion we're having around tables. And I mean, I'm thinking about my own extended families and how for some parts of my extended family, it's not a meal if you aren't all seated around a table. And other parts of my extended family where the expectation is there are so many people who are coming to the meal that there's no way there's no table that's big enough. So the table is where you put the food. And then you let people or expect people in kind of little pods to sort of circulate around. But expecting everybody to be seated at the table in an orderly way is kind of antithetical to the function of gathering. So yeah, I mean, I think this is probably one of those things that's far more contextually and culturally shaped than I had realized before the conversation happened.
Well,
what I was getting at, was most of the world's population, I think, sit on the floor and eat. That's what I was getting at. And I see Dale Mark Benedict keeps making comments about tables and that they're universal. And yeah, I get that. But if you're going to, so then if we're actually meaning something else, then don't use table. But I see Clark has his hand up.
Okay. Well, and let's we'll come to the hands up and the comments as we finish with this discussion. So let's move on to the final question. Do you find these principles lend themselves to communication with the person in the worship space, the average worshiper, so to speak, and lend themselves in a way, of course, with your critiques factored in a way that both leads to perhaps personal transformation, but also a more activist faith?
Okay, I'm going to go first because I want to keep what I'm going to say brief and short and to the point.
Okay.
So I have a growing, sneaking suspicion that interfaith engagement is actually a third space. That is, it requires a certain kind of interest, willingness, curiosity, and a depth about one's own faith understandings that I wish wasn't so, but I think that's true. That is, when I think about the people I worship with, some of them are still pretty uninformed about what it means to be Christian. So that to have a conversation that is at all kind of meaningful with depth about interfaith kinds of questions is a little beyond them. But that's, I mean, so I'm just going to say that. And
well, let me think a bit with you on that. And what jumped into my mind was Martin Luther King Jr.'s World House speech, where he says we find ourselves living in this common house as Jews and Muslims and Christians and people of all languages, and we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or I think then he concludes, or perish alone as fools. Is interfaith as a third space. There's a part of me that resonates with that, but then there's a part of me that says that doesn't drive transformation to world house understandings which are needed for the future of the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, oh, sorry. You know, thinking of at a high level, I think once you start talking to people, we can have good conversations on these. I'm thinking of my own community where some of this stuff they'll think about and we're not sure what to do with, and it'll need to be explained. So when we say intersectional commitments, I mean there's a whole depth there, and most people will say, I'm Muslim. What do you mean? You know, that's my identity. And so the idea of intersectionality would have to be unpacked. So in reading this, you know, some of them might struggle. Some of them they'll immediately grasp, like preferential concerns for the poor, you know, loving the stranger, spreading of peace, tenderness. They'll be all on board. But other things that have a deep meaning given our present cultural moment in terms of complex frames of analysis would require that I think the words encapsulate would require a little bit of unpacking for folks who are everyday worshipers in my community, I feel.
Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful.
And I'll try to be brief too. So my answer is, so the question is, do the 10 principles confirm a skeletal framework for a public theology geared to the person in the worship space that is transformative and activist? My answer is possibly, not sure. But then I wanted to add, but it seems to me that it's necessary to reach beyond the, quote, people in the worship space, as there are fewer and fewer of them, but rather how do we reach people who are not worshippers and invite them to be part of such an intersectional, inclusive worldview? I mean, if anyone's got the answer to that, then speak up now.
But a critical point as we look at the future of religions or transformative forms of spirituality and community. Yeah, a good challenge.
Well,
There's a term for that in our tradition, very quickly, or not tradition, but in our kind of community space, it's called unmasked, the unmasked. I think they did a documentary on this as well, which is an increasing group of people.
Well, the other thing I would say is that a lot of the people I relate to and worship with are like their embedded theology again, and this might be something that nobody said explicitly, but it was kind of in the air. For some people, it was said explicitly, was that their embedded theology when it comes to other religions is, oh, I think I'm supposed to try to convert them. And if there's something about that feels repulsive or wrong or repugnant, then they prefer to just not talk about it and focus on interfaith and interreligious activities that do things like build houses together or reach out to legislators around a common concern. Like there's a pragmatic, issue-oriented coalition building that a lot of the people who I worship with are happy to get on board with. But it gets much more tender and nerve-wracking to start having a conversation about, well, am I supposed to convert them or are they going to try to convert me? And so if some of what we're seeking is a transformation, well, I guess I seek a transformation around that concern, that very emotional concern. And so to that extent, these principles, I think, paint a picture, but also don't help disarm that basic fear or concern.
Okay. Let me open it up for the next 7 minutes or so to comments or questions from other folks on the call. My co-director, Stephen Slavak, is going to facilitate that. So either do a hand raise or put a question or comment in the chat, and Stephen will facilitate asking those to our panelists.
All right, thank you very much. It looks like we have two hands, and I'll start with the first one, which I believe was Clark. Clark, do you want to start us out?
I have a quick thought in response to the various reactions to the idea of the common table. 2 points, actually. First, keep in mind that we started this discussion by reading a document composed by the Pope. And so, yes, there clearly is a vision of the table as the table of communion within a Christian community. But you know, as I got to thinking about it, and this is what happens with symbols, metaphors, it occurred to me that one of my all-time favorite poems comes from the Persian poet Rumi in the 13th century. And it ends with this image of people walking into a room and sitting around a common table. And he says, and I wish I had his exact words, the light falls differently on the various walls of that room as they sit down. Still light. And I guess what I envision, because this is such a highly condensed document that Sid drew out of our discussions, is that each of these phrases is not going to be sort of, oh yeah, I agree with that and let's move on. It's going to provoke a question, a problem, an observation. Even the idea of the migrant, which I very much appreciate Professor Berry's comments on immigrant, migrant. If you think about in these various world traditions, these stories about migrants, exiles, pilgrims, they are everywhere. The story of humanity is, for the world religions, almost invariably, in some sense, a story of the traveler, the person on a journey. And so to use the word migrant is literal in one sense, but religiously, it also opens up a huge symbolic world. And I hope that we have the opportunity, talking with both people in religious communities and beyond them, to allow that richness to expand out and influence the way people think about one another and themselves. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Clark. Okay, we've got a couple more hands, and I apologize if I don't say this correctly, but Mirkonjagini, or you can say how you say your name. But I see someone with a
yes,
hello.
hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, perfect, perfect. I was trying to put my camera on, but it's not letting me. For whatever reason, it says it won't let me. I have to look into that. Sorry about that. Yeah, my first name is Manaz. I go by Albert, he, him pronouns. And I just wanted to, pitch in here because this sort of dialogue is really up my alley. The only thing I wanted to pitch in here is the key importance for me anyways is the concept of the environment and going back to nature. So when I interact with so many different types of people, on the daily. It's been a few months now. I've been on a spiritual journey for to pray for the universe and the environment. I've been doing this on the lands and meeting people across Canada, and specifically for the last few months in Newfoundland. And I've interacted with several types of people while I've been praying and offering my salat in dynamic places like the gym or a restaurant or in nature. And many people have asked me questions, non-Muslims, atheists, Scientologists, Christians, Catholics. And I love hearing people, I do, and I love listening to them. And when it comes to the notion of what I'm focused on, unity in my prayers and in my practice, I always draw it back to the environment. So after hearing people and their criticisms of Islam and my prayers, or why I do this or why I do that, I listen and I draw it back to the piece of science and anthropology and evolution. And I pull from, in my practice anyways, from all the Abrahamic traditions. So all the prophets and messengers, which is inherent in Islam, but it's also a part of my persona as a historian, as someone that's passionate about psychology. So the only piece I wanted to throw in, because Rabbi asked a question, she said, if anybody has an answer to this, please speak up now, is I just wanted to throw in that focus on data and science as one of the pieces that can help. It's not a solution by any means when people interact in a courageous conversation of interfaith. It's a very sensitive time for people to be vulnerable to criticisms from others if they're not in a good space themselves. But I like to take that science approach that at the end of the day, we are all physical beings, yet spiritual in a means based on science and anatomy. And that cosmos connection of consciousness comes into play. And that's all I wanted to just throw in there. And I'm going to see why this camera didn't work. I'm sorry about that.
You know,
It's science. It's science.
it's science. Thank you for that comment, Albert. I want to just point out something here in light of that comment very briefly, where it says in the point number 1, when which we share a visceral connection to all human beings. Visceral has the biological aspect, but we also have that connection being coded with the genes that we have with all other life forms, not just humans, and elementally with the cosmos, with our very molecular structure. So that expands the vocabulary. Thank you.
And all kinds of, like, seeds migrate, so plants migrate, and so do the creatures. So of course humans migrate. I mean, would be another way that I that turning into environmental ethics and eco-theology has helped me think about the human person differently.
Stephen, I think we have opportunity for one more question or comment if there is one.
I think we do have one. Amy.
Hello, everyone. Hello, thank you so much for this opportunity. I just wanted to say I'm just very humbled. I am not a very academic person in theology, but this idea of being curious, even though maybe you don't have a full understanding of even my own, Professor Barry, and you talked about some people who maybe don't even have a full grasp of maybe their own faith, then perhaps not being able to participate in a wider discussion. And I think curiosity is wonderful to open our minds, and just to be able to hear and start to be able to think as just, I consider myself a little bit more of a common person than some of you folks. And it's wonderful to be able to hear so many perspectives in this miracle of Zoom that we've discovered over these past couple of years. And to just be able to hear, and when I listen to Rabbi talk about the table, I think this is an opportunity, because sometimes in our small tables, we have these discussions and we think we all understand it, and then we come to this wider space, then maybe it's not perceived in the same way. And so I started to think, because I thought, well, of course, when I heard that word table, it made me think, yes, it's just open for everyone. But hearing from Rabbi, I think that we, hearing it makes me think, it's good to hear that and to know maybe there is a different word that we could use. Maybe it's gathering. Everyone's welcome at the gathering or wherever, whatever it is, because all faiths do have some gathering and some discussion and all of that. So I just appreciate, and even though I'm not highly educated in theology, there is this stirring within me to be a part of hearing at least all of these ideas. And when there is an activity that I'm able to participate in, I love to hear and to open my thinking a little bit more so that I can be a little bit more aware in my role. I'm an elementary teacher, so it's good for me to hear some of these other perspectives, and I'm trying to wrestle a little bit more with some of the things that I say to children that I've said for many, many years, that now in these past few years, some of these more open discussions that we're having as a larger community makes me think again about some of the things I say to children. I'm wrestling a bit with, well, what do I say instead? So it's nice to hear perspectives from all of you folks that spend so much of your time working on these ideas. So thank you very much for this discussion tonight.
Well, and let me thank Karen and Melinda and Mahan for this, to borrow the words, stirring conversation. And stirring, I think, is what all of us are seeking, because stirring is that first step in our own transformation and our collective transformation. This has been a rich conversation. I wish it could go on and on. The second half of this conversation will occur on February 10th, again at 6 p.m. Joining us with additional perspectives will be Dr. Tim Matovina, who's chair of the Notre Dame Theology Department, who will be commenting from Latinx and liberation theological perspective. Also, Reverend Dr. Jay Johnson, a former faculty member at the Pacific School of Religion and currently rector at All Saints Episcopal Church. And then the third commentator will be Dr. Yu Page from the Notre Dame Theology Department, commenting from a Black theology perspective. So I invite all of you to join in the second half of this conversation, and a heartfelt thanks to our three presenters who did a wonderful, provocative, inspiring launch of this discussion. My thanks to everyone. Have a good evening.